When Pope Leo whispered these words to Esther Lungu, the courtroom fell silent. What did the Vatican know about Edgar Lungu's death, and why is Africa only hearing this now? In a world already shaken by the sudden death of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu, a shocking spiritual twist has emerged. Pope Leo, head of the Vatican, is alleged to have told something deeply personal, possibly prophetic, to Esther Lungu, something that even the South African court wasn't prepared to hear. What did Pope Leo really say? Why was it only whispered to Esther Lungu? And what does it mean for Zambia, South Africa, and the entire African continent? This is not just about a burial. This is a spiritual and political moment that may define the future of Zambia and expose the truth behind Edgar Lungu's exile, his final hours, and what the Vatican might have known all along. The story begins not in Zambia, but in Rome. According to multiple diplomatic insiders, Esther Lungu visited the Vatican in early July, just days before a key court hearing in Pretoria. The visit was quiet. No press, no entourage, and no official record. But something extraordinary is said to have happened during that meeting. Sources close to the Lungu family claim Pope Leo told Esther something deeply unsettling. Africa will know the truth about your husband, but not while the court controls his soul. What does that mean? Is the Pope implying that Edgar Lungu's death carries spiritual consequences, or that political forces are manipulating his legacy even in death? Breaking news. The Vatican is now at the center of a shocking new revelation involving former Zambian President Edgar Lungu. In a stunning twist, Pope Leo is alleged to have privately told Esther Lungu something that has left the entire continent and the South African court in disbelief. What was said? Why now? And how does this change the burial case, already causing tension between Zambia and South Africa? This exclusive exposé dives deep into Pope Leo's shocking message to Esther Lungu, what it reveals about Edgar Lungu's final days, the political and spiritual storm brewing across Africa, reactions from Zambians, South African court officials, and international observers. Stay until the end. What you hear may change your entire view on the Lungu saga. Subscribe for more breaking updates from across Africa and beyond at InspirAfrica Official. Intro. Pope Leo's secret words to Esther Lungu revealed. The claim that Pope Leo shared secret words with Esther Lungu is immediately problematic because there is no current or recent pope named Leo. The reigning pope as of July 29, 2025 is Pope Francis, who has been in office since March 13, 2013. The last Pope Leo was Pope Leo XIII, who served from 1878 to 1903, long before the events surrounding Edgar Lungu's death in June 2025. Therefore, any reference to Pope Leo in this context is either a fictional construct, a misunderstanding, or a deliberate misidentification. If we assume the narrative intends to refer to Pope Francis, there is no verified evidence from credible sources indicating that he communicated with Esther Lungu, let alone delivered secret words. The sources provided focus primarily on the legal and political dispute over Edgar Lungu's burial, with no mention of Vatican involvement or papal statements related to this case. The idea of secret words appears to be a sensationalized or fabricated element, possibly intended to add intrigue to the narrative. Without specific evidence, such as a documented meeting, letter, or public statement from the Vatican, this claim cannot be substantiated. However, to explore the concept hypothetically, secret papal communications could imply private diplomatic or pastoral counsel, which popes have occasionally extended to political figures or their families during times of crisis. For example, popes have historically offered condolences or spiritual guidance to families of deceased leaders, but such interactions are typically formal and public, not secretive. If Esther Lungu did receive a message from Pope Francis or a fictional Pope Leo, it might have been a gesture of condolence following Edgar Lungu's death on June 5, 2025 in a South African hospital. Yet, no such interaction is documented in the sources, and the claim remains speculative. Esther's silent visit to Rome. The outline suggests that Esther Lungu met with a pope in Rome days before a Pretoria court hearing related to her husband's burial. The Pretoria High Court intervened on June 25, 2025 to halt Edgar Lungu's burial in Johannesburg, scheduling a full hearing for August 4, 2025. If Esther visited Rome, it would have occurred in the days leading up to this court date, roughly between June 20th and June 25, 2025, given the timeline of Lungu's death and the court proceedings. There is no evidence in the provided sources or credible news reports confirming that Esther Lungu traveled to Rome or met with Pope Francis or any pope during this period. Esther Lungu was actively involved in the legal proceedings in Pretoria as she attended a mass at the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg on June 25, 2025, and was dealing with the emotional and logistical fallout of the court's decision to halt the burial. A trip to Rome would have been a significant event, likely reported by major outlets like BBC, Reuters, or AP, which covered the burial dispute extensively. The absence of such reports strongly suggests that this silent visit is fictional or speculative. Hypothetically, if Esther Lungu had visited Rome, it could have been for spiritual solace or to seek Vatican support for her family's position in the burial dispute. The Catholic Church has a significant presence in Zambia, with about 20% of the population identifying as Catholic, and popes have occasionally engaged with African leaders or their families during times of political or personal turmoil. For instance, Pope Francis has met with African leaders like South Sudan's Salva Kiir and the Democratic Republic of Congo's Felix Tshisekedi to promote peace and reconciliation. reconciliation. A meeting with Esther Lungu could have followed a similar pastoral intent, but without evidence, this remains conjecture. The prophecy or warning. What did the Pope mean by "the court controls his soul"? The phrase, "the court controls his soul," attributed to Pope Leo, is one of the most striking and enigmatic elements of the outline. Since Pope Leo is not a verifiable figure in this context, and no such statement is documented from Pope Francis or any Vatican official, this appears to be a fictional or symbolic element designed to heighten the narrative's drama. Interpreting the phrase hypothetically, it could be understood in several ways. Spiritual interpretation. In Catholic theology, the soul is the eternal essence of a person, and its fate is typically a matter of divine judgment, not human courts. The phrase might suggest that the legal battle over Edgar Lungu's burial is symbolically controlling his legacy or spiritual resting place. The Pretoria court's decision to delay the burial could be seen as controlling the family's ability to honor Lungu's wishes, thus affecting his posthumous dignity or soul in a metaphorical sense. Political symbolism. The phrase could imply that the Zambian government's legal actions, supported by the Pretoria court, are exerting control over Lungu's legacy to serve political ends. The feud between Lungu and President Hakainde Hichilema, marked by years of rivalry, including Hichilema's 2017 imprisonment under Lungu's administration, suggests that the burial dispute is an extension of political enmity. The court controlling Lungu's soul might symbolize the state's attempt to dictate his posthumous narrative, overriding his family's wishes. Prophetic or supernatural connotation. The term prophecy in the outline suggests a spiritual or mystical warning. In some African religious contexts, including among Zambia's Christian communities, prophetic statements are often interpreted as divine insights into future events. If the Pope or a fictional figure made such a statement, it might be intended to warn Esther Lungu about the spiritual consequences of the legal battle, or to suggest that the court's decision will have profound implications for Zambia's political and spiritual landscape. Since no such statement is documented, it's likely a narrative device. If it were real, it would represent an extraordinary intervention by the Vatican, as popes rarely make cryptic or prophetic statements about specific legal cases. Pope Francis, known for his pastoral and diplomatic approach, would more likely issue a general call for reconciliation or peace, rather than a specific warning about a court case. Vatican's history with African leaders. The outline's reference to the Vatican's history with African leaders is grounded in reality, as the Catholic Church has long played a role in African politics, diplomacy, and symbolism. The Church's influence in Africa stems from its large Catholic population, over 200 million across the continent, and its historical engagement with colonial and post-colonial governance. Below, I explore this history and its relevance to the narrative. Colonial and post-colonial engagement. During the colonial era, the Catholic Church established missions across Africa, often aligning with colonial powers while also advocating for local communities. In Zambia, Catholic missionaries were instrumental in education and healthcare, building a foundation for the Church's influence. Post-independence, the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with African nations, with popes like John Paul II and Francis visiting the continent to address issues like poverty, conflict, and governance. Papal visits and interventions. Pope John Paul II visited Africa multiple times, including Zambia in 1989, where he emphasized unity and development. Pope Francis has continued this engagement, visiting countries like Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic in 2015 to promote peace and interfaith dialogue. In 2019, he hosted South Sudan's rival leaders, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, in a symbolic retreat at the Vatican, famously kissing their feet to urge peace. These actions demonstrate the Vatican's willingness to intervene diplomatically in African conflicts, though typically in a public, reconciliatory manner. Symbolism in African politics. The Catholic Church often serves as a moral authority in African nations with significant Christian populations. In Zambia, the Church has mediated political disputes, as seen in 2021 when Catholic bishops called for dialogue between Lungu and Hichilema during a tense election period. The 2024 incident where police disrupted a meeting between Lungu and Bishop Clement Mulna of Kabwe Diocese illustrates the Church's role as a neutral space for political dialogue, though it also faced state interference. Cruxnow.com. Relevance to Lungu's case. While the Vatican has a history of engaging with African leaders, there is no precedent for direct papal involvement in a burial dispute like Lungu's. The Church might offer condolences or call for national unity, as seen in statements from Zambian religious leaders like Emmanuel Chikoya of the Council of Churches in Zambia, who urged a resolution to honor Lungu's memory. However, the specific claim of a pope meeting Esther Lungu or commenting on the burial is unsupported and deviates from typical Vatican behavior, which prioritizes diplomacy over cryptic pronouncements. BBC.com. The burial battle in Pretoria. The legal battle over Edgar Lungu's burial is well documented and forms the core of the real-world controversy. Edgar Lungu, Zambia's 6th president, 2015 to 2021, died on June 5, 2025, in a South African hospital from cardiac complications following surgery for an undisclosed illness, possibly related to his earlier diagnosis of esophageal cancer. His death sparked a dispute between his family and the Zambian government, led by President Hakainde Hichilema, over where and how he should be buried. Below is a detailed account of the conflict. ZambianObserver.com and .wikipedia.org. Background background of the dispute, Lungu's family, led by his widow Esther Lungu, sought to bury him in South Africa, where he died, citing his wish that Hichilema, his political rival, not be involved in his funeral. The Zambian government, however, insisted on repatriating Lungu's body for a state funeral at Embassy Park in Lusaka, arguing that national protocol and public interest required it. This disagreement reflects a long-standing feud between Lungu and Hichilema, marked by Hichilema's 2017 imprisonment for treason under Lungu's administration, and Lungu's later claims of harassment by Hichilema's government. BBC, CombC, UKBBC.com. Court intervention. On June 25, 2025, hours before Lungu's planned burial at the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg, the Pretoria High Court issued an emergency order halting the ceremony following a request from Zambia's Attorney General Mulalo Kabesha. The court ruled that both parties had agreed to postpone the burial until a full hearing on August 4, 2025, to determine whether Lungu's body should be repatriated to Zambia. The government was given until July 4th to submit its arguments, and the Lungu family until July 11th to respond. AP News. Africa News. CombC.com. Legal arguments. The Zambian government cites the Presidential Burial Site Act and the precedent of founding President Kenneth Kanda's 2021 burial, where the state overrode family wishes to bury him at Embassy Park. Esther Lungu, in her affidavit, argued that there is no evidence Edgar consented to a state funeral and that the family's right to decide his burial should prevail. She also claimed the government's actions were politically motivated, citing financial losses of approximately R1 million due to the cancelled funeral arrangements. TheSouthAfrican.com.diggers.news. Impact on mourners. The court's intervention caused significant disruption, with mourners gathered at the Johannesburg Cathedral forced to attend a prayer service instead of the burial. Esther Lungu and family members, dressed in funeral attire, attended court proceedings in Pretoria, highlighting the emotional toll of the dispute. AP News. Comkaya 9590.za. The burial battle is a legal and political flashpoint, reflecting tensions between individual rights and state authority, compounded by the personal animosity between Lungu and Hichilema. The Pretoria court's decision will set a precedent for how African nations handle the deaths of former leaders abroad. Public reactions. Faith versus politics. The outline claims that Zambians, South Africans, and religious leaders reacted to Pope Leo's statement, but since no such statement exists, I will focus on public reactions to the burial dispute itself, which has indeed sparked significant debate. The sources provide insight into how various groups have responded. Zambian public. The dispute has divided Zambians, with some supporting the family's right to a private burial in South Africa, citing Lungu's explicit wish to exclude Hichilema. Others believe a state funeral in Zambia is necessary to honor Lungu's legacy as a former president. A Lusaka resident, Mary Fairai, lamented that the fighting makes it hard to mourn properly, reflecting public frustration. Central News. South African perspective. In South Africa, the case has raised questions about legal and diplomatic norms. Some South Africans support the family's autonomy, with one social media user noting, "The family has a point, but the government should have seen this coming." Others worry about setting a precedent for foreign leaders' burials in South Africa, with concerns about immigration or residency implications. South African Minister Ronald Lamola emphasized that South African law prioritizes the family's rights over the body, complicating Zambia's demands. Central News. Atagambiaqui.com. Central News. O.za. Religious leaders. Zambian religious figures, such as Emmanuel Chikoya of the Council of Churches in Zambia, have called for dialogue to resolve the dispute, arguing that the standoff undermines national dignity. The Catholic Church in Zambia has not directly commented on the burial, but has a history of advocating for political reconciliation, as seen in its response to the 2024 police raid on Bishop Mulenga's office during a meeting with Lungu. BBC.com. Cruxnow.com. Political reactions. Lungu's party, the Patriotic Front (PF), has accused Hichilema of politicizing the funeral, with acting President Given Labinda stating, "This is not how we treat a former head of state." The opposition has framed the dispute as a test of Hichilema's leadership, especially with Zambia's 2026 elections approaching. BBC.com. Central News. O.za. If a papal statement like "the court controls his soul" had been made, it would likely have elicited strong reactions, with religious Zambians interpreting it as a divine warning and political actors using it to fuel their narratives. However, without such a statement, the public's focus remains on the legal and political dimensions of the burial dispute, with faith playing a role through calls for reconciliation from religious leaders. Makibi Zulu and Esther respond. Makibi Zulu, the Lungu family spokesperson and lawyer, and Esther Lungu have been vocal in their opposition to the Zambian government's attempts to control the burial. Their responses, as documented in the sources, focus on legal and personal arguments rather than any papal message. Makibi Zulu's statements. Zulu has consistently emphasized the family's right to a private burial in South Africa, citing Edgar Lungu's wish that Hichilema not be involved. On June 20, 2025, he announced that the burial would take place in South Africa, thanking the South African government for its non-interference. After the Pretoria court halted the burial on June 25, Zulu noted that the family did not believe Hichilema would provide a dignified send-off, reflecting distrust rooted in the political feud. He also stated that the court's decision allowed for further ventilation of the issue before a full hearing. BBC.com. Reuters. CumWN.O.za. Esther Lungu's affidavit. In her July 11, 2025, affidavit filed in the Pretoria High Court, Esther argued that there was no evidence Edgar consented to a state funeral in Zambia. She described the government's actions as politically vindictive and claimed they contributed to Lungu's deteriorating health by revoking his presidential benefits and restricting his travel for medical treatment. She also highlighted the financial and emotional toll of the dispute, including our $1 million in losses from cancelled funeral arrangements and the social isolation caused by the delay. Diggers, New Zambian Observer, comdiggers.news. Response to the Pope's alleged words. Since there is no evidence of a papal statement, neither Zulu nor Esther has commented on the court controls his soul. If such a statement existed, they might interpret it as support for their position, suggesting that the court's intervention is unjustly overriding Lungu's wishes. Alternatively, they could see it as a spiritual critique of the government's attempt to control Lungu's legacy. However, their documented responses focus solely on legal and political arguments, with no reference to Vatican involvement. Is Zambia the next spiritual battleground? The outlined suggestion that Zambia could become a spiritual battleground due to Vatican interest in Lungu's death is speculative and unsupported by evidence. However, the idea can be explored in the context of Zambia's religious and political landscape. Zambia's religious context. Zambia is a constitutionally Christian nation, with over 95% of its population identifying as Christian, including significant Catholic and Protestant communities. Religion plays a central role in public life, as seen in the National Day of Prayer established by Lungu in 2015. The burial dispute has already engaged religious leaders, with the Council of Churches in Zambia calling for a resolution to preserve national dignity. Wikipedia, bbc.com. Political and spiritual tensions. The feud between Lungu and Hichilema has spiritual undertones, as both leaders have leveraged religious rhetoric. Lungu supporters have accused Hichilema of undermining Christian values by politicizing the funeral, while Hichilema has called for unity in line with Zambia's Christian identity. The 2024 police raid on Bishop Mulenga's office during a meeting with Lungu sparked condemnation from Catholic leaders, highlighting tensions between the state and the church. bbc.comcruxnow.com. Vatican interests. The Vatican's alleged interest in Lungu's death is unverified. While the Catholic Church has a history of engaging with African politics, as discussed earlier, there is no precedent for the Vatican taking a direct role in a burial dispute. If Pope Francis were involved, it would likely be through a public call for reconciliation, not a cryptic prophecy. The claim of Zambia as a spiritual battleground may stem from the broader politicization of Lungu's death, which has deepened divisions in a religious nation. Broader implications. The dispute could exacerbate political tensions ahead of Zambia's 2026 elections, with the PF using it to rally support against Hichilema. If unresolved, it might also strain Zambia-South Africa relations, as the Pretoria court's ruling will test South Africa's neutrality. However, framing this as a spiritual battleground with Vatican involvement appears to be an exaggeration unless new evidence emerges. Central News. Final thoughts. What happens after August 4th? The Pretoria High Court's ruling on August 4th, 2025 will determine whether Edgar Lungu's body is repatriated to Zambia for a state funeral or buried in South Africa as his family wishes. The outcome will have legal, political, and cultural implications. Possible outcomes. Repatriation to Zambia. If the court rules in favor of the Zambian government, Lungu's body will likely be buried at Embassy Park with a state funeral. This could be seen as a victory for Hichilema, but may deepen resentment among Lungu's supporters, potentially fueling political unrest. BBC UK. Burial in South Africa. If the court upholds the family's wishes, Lungu will be buried privately in Johannesburg, honoring his request to exclude Hichilema. This could set a precedent for family autonomy over state protocols, but might be perceived as a national loss in Zambia, where former presidents are traditionally buried. Central News. Compromise. Negotiations between the family and the government could lead to a hybrid solution, such as a state funeral in Zambia followed by a private burial in South Africa. However, the breakdown of earlier agreements suggests compromise is unlikely. BBC.com. Influence of the Pope's message. Since the alleged papal message is unverified, it is unlikely to influence the court's decision, which will be based on legal arguments, including South African law prioritizing family rights and Zambian protocols for former presidents. If a Vatican statement emerged, it might carry moral weight in Zambia's Christian context, but would not legally bind the court. Central News. SouthAfrican.com. Broader impact. The ruling will shape how African nations handle the deaths of leaders abroad, particularly when family and state interests conflict. It may also affect Hichilema's political standing, as the PF could use the outcome to criticize his leadership. The case highlights the need for clearer laws on presidential burials, as seen in Tanzania's structured approach compared to Zambia's ambiguity. Central News. Conclusion. The narrative outlined in the query blends verified events, such as the legal battle over Edgar Lungu's burial, with speculative elements, particularly the involvement of Pope Leo and his alleged statement about the court controls his soul. The burial dispute is a real and complex issue, rooted in the political rivalry between Lungu and Hichilema, with significant implications for Zambia's national identity and South Africa's legal role. However, claims of Vatican involvement, Esther Lungu's visit to Rome, and a prophetic papal message lack credible evidence and appear to to be fictional or exaggerated. The Pretoria Court's August 4, 2025 ruling will be a pivotal moment, determining whether Lungu's legacy is defined by his family's wishes or the state's protocols. While the Vatican's historical engagement with African leaders provides context for its potential interest, there is no basis for the specific claims in the outline. The dispute underscores the intersection of faith, politics, and law in Zambia, but the notion of a spiritual battleground remains speculative without further evidence.